Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Certainly, we are getting deeper into the semester. And of course, we just have a few more chapters to tackle. And of course, the latest chapter that you've now clicked on is journalism. And really, this is going to be part one. And this is going to be covering, in most part, the broadcast side and convergence side of the journalism industry. Part two, we'll talk more about newspapers. And if I could point out one other item here, is that basically this is a combination of chapter 14 and chapter 8. So in any event, let's get started with part one of journalism, which, is near and dear to my heart because, as you know, my background is in journalism. I work at ABC7 as a sports producer. I have been in the journalism industry literally since going to the University of Colorado as a broadcast journalism major. So it's really been a big part of my life. So in any event, let's get started. And I think probably to get started at the very top, you really have to define what news is. And I think, because you hear that term, I'm going to watch the news tonight. I'm going to read the news. This is in the news, right? You hear the term news, and basically, what is it? How do you define what news is? Well, the book says, this is what you'd probably read in the chapter, the process of gathering information and making narrative reports that offer selected frames of reference that help people make sense of important events, political issues, cultural trends, prominent people, and unusual happenings in everyday life. That is the gist of what is the definition of news. I have, which is absolutely 100% accurate. And you can read that again if you need to hear that again. But I have it kind of sliced a little bit different way, but it definitely relates to all of the things that are in the textbook's definitions. So this is actually something that I teach out of in my MEA 125 class, which I teach on campus here at COC. So if any of you who are sitting here as online students, if you're ever thinking about taking a class, this certainly would be something that would be, I think, of interest to you in MEA 125, but I digress. All right, so this is what I tell my 125 class. This is kind of the easiest way to determine what makes something newsworthy. Well, first of all, timeliness. Okay, so it's right there in the name. In news, it's new, right? The whole reason that we have any interest at all in watching a story, listening to a story, clicking on a story on our social media feed is that we want to see what's new, right? And without getting too specific here, there's lots of stories that we will click on to get the latest on. Maybe it's a fire, maybe it's the weather, maybe it's something as simple as wanting to know if the Dodgers or Rams are winning, or Lakers, although who knows with the Lakers. But in any event, it's news is news. So, if it's a presidential election, we obviously want to know what the latest vote count is. If it's, an important bill that's being passed, an important Supreme Court decision, something here locally in Santa Clarita, the city council is discussing something that, is something that connects to you, then you want to know what the latest is. So news is new. It's also proximity, which is that news happens close by. We are always more interested in things that happen here in our communities, right? Now, I know some of you live in Santa Clarita, some of you live in other communities when you go to school here, and that's totally cool. But my guess is that when something happens in your hometown, wherever that might be, or just here like in the Los Angeles area, you're going to be far more interested in it than if it's something elsewhere. Now, there are overriding reasons to, what I call like Trump proximity. So, for example, Ukraine, which is thousands of miles away, that's been the big story in 2022, from March to 2022 and on. And of course, that's thousands of miles away. Yet, even here, we are still interested in it because it has another factor to it. But proximity is very important. So, for example, I'm here at College of the Canyons in Santa Clarita. And if there is a huge accident out on Interstate 5, which runs right alongside the college here, or there's a big pursuit, right? I'm going to be interested in it. It's because it's right here. I might know somebody that's in the accident, right? It might affect me getting to school here. It might affect my commute if it's a pursuit, right? All of that makes sense. But if those same factors happen, or that same type of story happens in, say, I don't know, let's say Atlanta, Georgia, or Miami, Florida, or Dallas, Texas, or Denver, Colorado, probably not going to be something that we are too concerned with, nor are going to hear about, because it's just not in our neighborhood or in our region. There's also prominence, right? The more important a person, the more valuable he or she is as a news source. So we are interested in important people. Okay. So if it's a celebrity, clearly, we have, especially in Los Angeles, we're a celebrity culture. So therefore, if there's something happening in Hollywood that's got some kind of, sort of titillating factor to it, we're going to be interested. Think back to April, when, because I'm assuming you're seeing this beyond April of this year. But anyway, think back to just recently, or if you're watching this maybe in the future, think back to the spring of 2022 and Alec Baldwin. Yes, well, there's an example. My gosh, I was going to say Johnny Depp, but yeah, remember the story about Alec Baldwin shooting somebody on the set of a movie set in New Mexico last fall, or I think it was last fall. In any event, that made national news, and it made national news because it was not just prominence because of being Alec Baldwin on a movie set, but you could also classify that as human interest as well. But I was actually thinking about Johnny Depp in the defamation trial with his former wife. That is something that we're interested in. Now, if it was just two people in a, kind of a crappy divorce, and there was a lot of he said, she said, but we didn't know who they were, nobody would care, right? So, except for people closest to them. So prominence is the more important person, the more valuable he or she is as a news source. Then there's consequence and impact. Events that affect a great many people have a built-in news value. This is what we see a lot of on local news coverage. This is what we read about on websites. This is what we see on our Twitter feed. Important Supreme Court decisions, the economy. Obviously, we're dealing with inflation right now, and that, of course, falls under the consequence and impact category of deciding what news is. Earthquakes, Southern California. Ooh, can't wait, right? They've happened in the past. They're going to happen in the future. Then there's human interest, stories that are ironic, bizarre, uplifting. These, there's even a word that's not on the screen here that I've heard before called deviant, right? We are interested in things that are just out of the ordinary. So think about why things go viral on social media. It's because it falls in the human interest category. It also is very much a part of, just an unusual happening is something that we will our ears will perk up like my Chihuahua at home, right? So human interest. All right. So that again is also this. So you can see that they do connect. All right. Where do we get our news? Well, certainly it's been a dramatic change from past to present. Of course, going way back to the beginning of time, essentially beginning of human civilization, it was the word of mouth. And we've talked about that in communication. The word of mouth was the early way because there was no other technology in which to transmit the news or to even so much as put a printing press on it, right? So it was not necessarily reliable, but it was still news. It was just told with a slant because think about a game of telephone, right? If you've ever heard that game, it's like where you have 12 people, you can line them up in a room and you tell somebody something to the first person, and by the time it gets to the 12th person, the story is completely changed because everyone puts their own interpretation on it. So then we had the Pony Express, right? Which is to say news travel as fast as horseback, which, what are we talking about? Maybe top speed 20 miles an hour. Then you had the telegram, instant communication. Okay, that came along obviously in the late 1830s, early 1840s. This idea that you could type out in Morse code, send it through a wire, and suddenly you had instant communication. Also, trains, ships, any mode of transportation. Eventually, we got obviously we've had newspapers for a long time. That was somehow where we got our news. In present day, we have television, we have radio, we have the internet, we have social media, which is good and bad all at the same time. We've talked about sort of the function and dysfunction of social media in the past. Obviously, newspapers are still present, although they're, very much, we'll talk more about newspapers and where they stand now. Magazines are another outlet in which we get news. We also get news through, believe it or not, talk radio. You remember our whole thing on talk radio and podcast. Clearly some people driving home from work or driving to work will listen to, a talk show radio host person, and sometimes get their news updates that way. We certainly have, lots of podcasts out there that, where people talk about newsworthy items or comment on the news. But and we could say the same thing with cable news, by the way. Be careful though, because those in particular have a bias, right? Or I wouldn't say all, but many have, come with a slant. They are talking to you about a particular story, and right away they've created a narrative to go with that, either because they truly believe it or because they feel like it will cause the most, it will cause people to kind of listen, and it's controversial, and it will, implore people to call in and listen more. So yeah, so that's always a tough one. And of course, so accuracy, always an interesting factor there. And I would say we're going to talk more about sort of the how news is perceived these days in just a little bit here. All right. So news by the numbers. And this is, I think you'll find this very interesting. So newsroom employment. This is television, this is digital, this is newspapers, right? Anything that has to do with kind of like news gathering, whether it be in broadcast, print, or web, dropped 26% between 2008 and 2020. Now, there are a number of factors for that. It's not just that the industry is kind of constricted. It has. But some of that is also technology. So, I mean, I can tell you just from personal experience working at my news station that that technology, that automation has clearly downsized our newsroom. What I mean by that is we used to have a number of cameramen in the studio, and we had a number of editors in the building, and we had a full team that was behind the scenes, kind of like putting on a live show, and because of computers and automation, we don't have to have those same cameramen in the studio. We don't have to have a ton of people in the control room to put on a show, and we don't have to have as many editors because someone like me who knows how to edit can do both jobs, not just one. So that's been part of it. Obviously, another part of it is there's less money in the industry at times, particularly from the network side and newspaper side. So there's been layoffs, but that's not to say that the industry is not, the industry doesn't have, doesn't have its pluses too. So don't want to just go all doomsday on you here. But 85,000 employed in the news industry as of 2020, down from 114,000, but that has stabilized. And I do think that we have kind of seen the sort of the hardest part of it. And I think we're through that. Average salary is $45,000 per year. If that sounds low, yeah, you're not going to get rich as a journalist. It's just, not the way it is, but the price per hour is about $21.86 per hour. Now, this does vary because if you work in, say, like New York or California, or what I call a bigger market, with a higher population center, chances are your salary is going to be much higher than if you work in, say, like Wyoming, which is the least populated state in the country, where I worked way back in the day. I was not, I never made $45,000 a year. I make significantly more now that I'm here in Los Angeles. But anyway, on average, the highest average salary in New York, I should say, $64,000 a year. The lowest is Alabama at 33.2. And again, these are just averages. And I think I do have a graphic coming up here that'll show you a little more specifically what people make. But this includes reporters, photographers, editors, right? Another thing you should know, local stations, which your local stations here are ABC7, CBS2, KTLA, NBC4, KCAL. I know I'm missing one off the top of my head, but anyway, those are your local stations. They devote about 6.2 hours a day to local news, which is up more than 3.5 hours from 2004. There is a simple reason for that, because they can keep the lion's share of their revenue when they produce local content. So at night, when we watch primetime programming, right? You watch like a CSI or some kind of network show, the network keeps that money. But when a local station is doing its local news, or in like ABC's case, we're doing like a slam dunk, we do a basketball show, we run ads, that money gets kept by, well, in this case, since we're owned and operated by ABC, the money actually, I think why it stays local, but it's part of the ABC family. But there's a lot of stations out there, guys, that aren't owned by, say, like ABC, like the company, like Disney, which owns ABC. My station that I worked for in Cheyenne was bought and sold like 3 or 4 different times, and was owned by big time independent production companies, and they're the ones that got the money. So anyway, I hope that makes sense. 37% of U.S. adults get news from local news, down 9% from 2016. It's kind of a little bit of a struggle right now, because there's so many ways that you guys can clearly get your news and information from. You're not getting it from like just local news now, or just network news. All of those numbers are down. Take me, for instance, who works in local news. I generally will, follow the, I may hop on the website for ABC7. I might follow the app, the ABC7 app. I follow a number of news apps for that matter. And a lot of times I just get bulletins on my phone, and that's how I kind of keep up. I don't sit there and, turn on the TV at 5 o'clock at night to watch local news. I used to, but, like you, I get it a la carte. And so that's something that, and so one thing, if I could say, is that, news stations around the country are trying to go the digital route. And yeah, so anyway, we'll talk more about that as we get through this chapter. All right, so how much money, right? How much money can you expect to make? Because I know some of you who, obviously, hopefully, are going to college, aren't just doing this just to, have something to do. You actually have a purpose for whatever it is you're trying to, learn. And so for those of you that are interested in any kind of like production or journalism job, here are the median hourly wages of selected occupations in radio and TV broadcasting as of May 2019. I could not find something a little more recent, but that's okay. These are pretty much standard for, I think everything's kind of sort of leveled during the pandemic. So this is pre-pandemic, but you can see that if you're a general or operations manager, on average, you're going to make about $52 an hour. If you're a producer or director, $30.78 an hour. And then you can kind of read the rest. I don't need to be a parrot here, but obviously you're looking at the different jobs and how much you make hourly. Now, I will say, I was surprised to see advertising sales agents at $22 an hour, because generally speaking, if you sell advertising for a television station, with commission and everything, you do fairly well. But I guess this is, again, a average over an entire country where you have big markets like Los Angeles, where our sales reps do fairly well, all the way down to like a market like Cheyenne, Wyoming, that only, that is only has what, 450,000, 475,000 in the entire state. So, it's very, very interesting. Anyway, let's move on though. Let's talk about categories of news reporting. Okay. Well, and there are, basically I'd say three major categories of news and reporting. And they should be easy to spot, particularly after I kind of share them with you, and then maybe you can challenge yourself to see if, where a story that you watch falls in and which category. But clearly the number one or the most common category is hard news. It makes up the bulk of news reporting. Hard news includes the 5 W's and the H. If you're wondering what that is the who did it, what happened, where did it happen, why did it happen, and when did it happen? And of course, we can't forget the how did it happen. So it's who, what, why, where, when, and how. So any story, you should be able to answer those types of questions, right? So next, when you get done with this, like part one of this lecture, maybe click on a story and see if, challenge yourself to ask yourself, see if you can answer the questions that are in that. Anyway, it has significance, hard news does, for large numbers of people. So again, fires, earthquakes, big court decisions, legislation, right? Inflation, a high-speed pursuit, outside your house, maybe obviously the pandemic, right? Anything to do with COVID, that is hard news. Goodness knows we've had, a lot of it lately, right? But it'll lead off the top of news broadcasts, front page of the newspaper or the media website that you go to. Those are always usually hard news. So if I was to click on foxnews.com and give you an example, you would see, well, let me do that just for fun. And just in the interest of fairness, I will also do CNN. Give me a second here on my other screen. So here is, for example, let me stop sharing and show you this. So here is, for example, Fox News, right? What do we have here? We have a murder, right? A high-profile murder here. We have the whole thing about Florida. Again, this is recorded in spring of 22. But this was obviously, Florida has been in the news for a bunch of different reasons, but this one essentially was rejecting critical race theory in textbooks. Here's a story about Hillary Clinton. Here we have mass robbers stealing $400,000 of merchandise from a Louis Vuitton store, right? So all of these things here are all related to hard news. So let's go to CNN.com. And we see here Russia, Ukraine, of course. We have a congressional, Republican congressional person testifying about the, January 6th stuff. The quote unquote insurrection. Here's a story about Florida, right? So if everything at the top here is all very much hard news. You only start to see some of the other stuff, other stories start to pop up, as you scan down. So that's what I wanted you to get out of that. So let me stop sharing here for a second. All right, so let me get back to our screen. So that is hard news, okay? So feel free on your own time to kind of poke around different media websites and see, where you see examples of hard news. Oh boy, you know what? This got out of order. So let me remind me, I'll get back to that. I need to fix that. In fact, I'll probably when you go to your PowerPoint, it will be fixed. But yeah, definitely that's something I'm gonna put further down here. So I'll get back to that. But anyway, soft news is the next one. Nothing perfect there, right? Soft news. Okay. You have feature stories that cover a wide territory. It interests the audience. It relies on human interest for news value. It appeals to people's curiosity, sympathy, skepticism, or amazement. Soft news can be about places, people, animals, topics, events, or products. It's basically a feature story. They can be entertaining. They can be emotional. They can be dramatic. They can pull on your heartstrings. I think soft news is, first of all, I think feature storytelling is an art form. I think it is what I think we better connect sometimes to stories that are feature stories than hard news stories, in the sense that I think we're so desensitized. I don't know if that's the right word, but I'll use it anyway. I think we've become desensitized in a way to hard news, right? Because think about how often we've heard about COVID, and think about how often we've heard about some politician saying something that we disagree with, or, another story about, another murder, right? I mean, you hate to say it, but we all kind of go, oh man, I don't know if I want to listen to that again, because it's all we always think about when we think of news. We think, that we're just going to get like, several stories of just that, right? So I think feature stories have a tendency to sort of go beyond that. They have a tendency to evoke emotions in us that aren't so, I think so visceral or raw. So I want to show you an example, and real quick, I'm going to adjust my little slide down here so I don't forget. Okay, so anyway, let me go back to soft news. I want to show you an example of what I think is a great soft news story. So I have a former student, his name is Jonathan Gonzalez, who was in our MEA program here. And he has since, become a very, not just famous, but I think very successful journalist here locally in Los Angeles. John was a student in our program. He actually went from here to Cal State Northridge. After he graduated, he started doing some reporting in Bakersfield, then went to Denver, Colorado, where he was doing some reporting, a lot of feature reporting and some part-time anchoring. And then about 5 years ago, he came back home here to Los Angeles. So if you know the name Jonathan Gonzalez, he's actually the weekend anchor at NBC4, and also does reporting during the week. So this is a story that he did in Colorado right before he left to come back here to Los Angeles. And it's something that you don't normally see here in LA. You don't see stories like this, which is kind of a bummer. But Denver, by the way, is really kind of keen on doing feature storytelling, along with kind of what I call the meat and potatoes. So let me share this with you here, and I think you'll get a kick out of it. If for some reason we have a copyright issue with this, what I'll have to do is you might just see me skip to the very next thing talking about investigative reports, but I will include this as well outside of this PowerPoint, just in case YouTube gets persnickety and wants me to take it down. It's been kind of a weird sort of vibe with copyright and YouTube these days, but I think we should be okay. Let's see. So anyway, let me share my other screen. Here is Jonathan Gonzalez. And this is not Jonathan, by the way. This is actually the guy introing him. But anyway, here we go.
Storyteller Nelson Garcia. What people take away from a trip to Crested Butte isn't always everything they brought with them. And tonight's storytellers, reporter Jonathan Gonzalez and photojournalist Ann Herbst, show us how the town has a unique way of getting people connected to the things that they've lost.
A lot of people stumbled across here.
People come here to get lost.
Sometimes when people leave wherever they're from,
I'm originally from New York.
Boulder. Rural Des Moines, Iowa.
It's less about what they lose, more about what they find.
Kind of just the way Crested Butte rolls, I guess. We find things here.
Nowhere in this mountain oasis is this more apparent,
and I want to get you some messages,
and more literal than here.
6:33 here at KBUT Crested Butte,
where the news of the day,
high temperatures should be about 40,
is balanced by songs spun by dozens of volunteer DJs.
Tedeschi Trucks, new album from them.
People aren't going to listen to the information you're bringing them unless you entertain them along the way.
But no segment may be as entertaining
We've got Lost on Elk Avenue
as the station's analog version of a Craigslist ad.
It's unbelievable what people put on the Lost and Found.
KBUT's Lost and Found is a daily service that helps reunite lost items in the Gunnison Valley to their rightful owners.
Someone found a Pyrex container full of salad.
For all of KBUT's 30 years on the air,
Baby blanket.
they've been reuniting the community.
I think hearing aid.
With all of their lost items.
Birth control pills. My husband said, boy, she's not going to have fun tonight. No, I shouldn't say that.
Write it down on a piece of paper.
A dark brown wallet.
And no matter what it is,
you kind of listen to.
They'll read it.
Well, what are people losing?
There have been turtles on the Lost and Found.
And it was moving very slowly. And I'm like, is this a turtle in my yard?
We've had, you know, dentures.
You couldn't miss the teeth. I mean, they were teeth.
Sometimes the owners come forward.
No one ever claimed the turtle.
Sometimes it's finders keepers, even with dentures.
No one is supposed to know that, but yes.
You would think in a town so small,
The town of Crested Butte is basically 10 by 10 blocks.
people wouldn't lose so much when they get here. Right, Marshall?
The Bermuda Triangle exists on those 3 blocks, and that's probably where the majority of stuff gets lost.
The what triangle?
Yeah, the Bermuda Triangle.
Bermuda Triangle.
There's 3 main bars in town.
Achievers, the Eldo, and the Talk of the Town.
On a Friday and Saturday night, once you get in, it's hard to get out.
How bad could a tiny piece of a tiny town be?
I found underwear. I don't understand how you go home without your underwear, but...
Though perhaps the most inexplicable tale of all.
Someone lost a chinchilla. It was reported alive but wounded.
She found this chinchilla, and so she brought it to the vet.
So we anesthetized him to splint his leg.
Yeah, I don't even know what that is. It's like a hedgehog or something, I think.
So we're airing it for like a week or whatever, lost chinchilla. So then she comes back about a week later and she said, oh, I got to take that off.
It was not a chinchilla. We found out that he was a woodland pack rat.
So it was a wild rodent.
We've got partly cloudy skies expected for the evening.
It's KBUT's way of helping Crested Butte.
It's that simple, it works.
Deal with what's lost.
It truly works.
So the community can focus on what it finds here every day.
Tranquility.
With photojournalist Ann Herbst.
Community.
Jonathan Gonzalez.
250 PBRs.
9 News.
Nobody claimed the turtle.
A chinchilla that wasn't a chinchilla.
No, it's a pack rat. Oh. That is fantastic.
It makes me want to go there and lose something.
Yeah, and see, like, is someone going to find it and then I want to listen to it on the radio? That is fantastic.
So
All
much
right.
fun.
So despite our digital world, KBUT says that they plan on keeping their old-fashioned techniques, which we don't.
All right, so that's Jonathan Gonzalez, Lost and Found. You know, a quick note on that before we move on. So he won an Emmy actually for that story, and that story came to be because his photographer Ann was skiing in Crested Butte, which is 6 or 7 hours southwest of Denver in the Rocky Mountains, and had heard this station and thought it would make a good story. So anyway, if there's anyone out there in the class that is interested in storytelling or journalism, this is good stuff. So anyway, called Lost and Found. Again, I will in all likelihood include the link to it as well. The link is on the PowerPoint, but I may make it separate with everything else, so you guys can easily click on that if you like. All right, so we also have investigative reports. Okay, that is investigative journalism. I think is at the very crux of why journalism is so important. Now, the journalism is known as the fourth estate. It's supposed to be, a thing about checks and balances on the very powerful. And there's some things that we'll talk about here coming up here in just a bit about where I think journalism has kind of gone wrong with that. But investigative journalism is is absolutely a part of it's a category of news and reporting. It is a way to unearth significant information about matters of public importance through the use of non-routine information gathering methods. So, for example, if you know your history, Watergate, the Watergate affair, which was during the Nixon administration, Bob Woodward, Carl Bernstein, basically uncovered, Richard Nixon and his, and his allies, doing some highly illegal stuff at the Watergate Hotel that led to Nixon actually resigning the presidency in 1973. So investigative journalism has been around quite some time. The problem is that it requires a good deal of time and money. So like, for example, local stations in many cases don't do it because they just don't have the resources to devote having one person or a series of people on just one story over a long period of time. They need to have them constantly doing stories and turning stories throughout the day. So that's kind of unfortunate, but the stories generally run longer because it takes more time to tell stories. And I will not actually show this to you during the lecture, but I want you to click on it. This is because I know it'll get flagged by YouTube. But I have provided the link in the PowerPoint. I'll also provide the link in in your weekly tasks so you can easily click on it. The story is called Londongrad, and it's done by 60 Minutes. And I will tell you that, I've said this before, that 60 Minutes is I think the gold standard of journalism. It really is. It along with doing some really cool feature storytelling, the reporters, the correspondents at 60 Minutes also do investigative journalism as well. And that's true to the spirit of Don Hewitt, who, when he created the show in 1968, had the famous motto, "Tell me a story." So Londongrad is the story of the fact that the Russian oligarchs, the Russian billionaires, right, who are, clearly with Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the Russian oligarchs, the rich guys in Russia have been in the spotlight as well. And there's been an effort to essentially choke off money in Russia. Well, it turns out that a lot of Russian oligarchs have been apparently laundering money or allegedly laundering money in a lot of areas of London, and including, I think, you may have heard the story about the Russian oligarch that owned the Chelsea Football Club in the Premier League. He was just one of, and he's mentioned in this story. So I'd like you, if you want, you can put my, this YouTube lecture on pause for just a second and go over and click on it and realize the story is about 11 to 13 minutes long. And that's exactly why 60 Minutes is so good, because it can spend more time, it can spend more resources and more money on telling a quality story. So it's an interesting look at the Russian oligarchs and what they're doing in London and in Great Britain and within the banking system there. Very fascinating. So either look at it once we get through this part one of this lecture, or you can just pause me now, open up another browser and look at it and then come back. So however you want to see it, check it out. There will be obviously a possibility that you will see some quiz questions. So I would not blow it off, is what I'm trying to tell you. All right. How about news reporting in the digital age? Okay, so I've talked about the types of stories that are out there, but we are also now in the digital age, which has completely revolutionized and changed news reporting. First of all, there's more sources of news, which is great, right? It's good and bad all at the same time. Back when I was in college, my sources of news were a newspaper, radio updates. Obviously, I'd have to stick around late in the afternoon to, watch TV news. It wasn't until like literally the early 80s, mid 80s that CNN came along and CNN headline news. And so it's a completely different game now because of social media and just our ability to, our phone apps. I mean, we have instant communication, right? And it's just, it's from top to bottom. The issue with that is that sometimes because of that, news has a tendency to travel faster than too fast, meaning that sometimes we will get stories that are just flat inaccurate, whether purposely or in more cases, it's just news organizations basically trying to one-up each other in terms of getting the news out there. And then unfortunately, we don't get the 100% of the story. So I could go on for an hour about that, but yeah, so we have an advantage and there's more sources of news. A disadvantage is in that sometimes there's some things that happen because of that aren't good. But what are these news sources in addition to what you think of, right? Well, blogs, of course. I have highlighted right there, Politico.com. That is probably the biggest political website, news website, that's on the internet. It's interesting because I've watched it evolve. And at one point, it was kind of seen as this outsider. And of course, now a lot of the people that work for Politico.com are former writers for major, publications like the Washington Post and the New York Times and the LA Times. But now when you go to college and you're going to be a journalist, you just, you're applying directly to something like Politico.com because it is, one of the, even though it's a quote unquote blog, it's considered one of the major outlets out there in terms of political news reporting. And of course, it has a seat at the table every time there's a White House press briefing, which was not always the case. There's also citizen journalism. So that's a newer term. And basically what that means is that news organizations are relying on, and we are relying on, people, because of their phones, are constantly recording things that are happening in the world and then sharing it publicly, very publicly, either on social media. News organizations are trolling social media on a daily basis, looking for these types of things. One of the first examples, by the way, of citizen journalism that I can think of, honestly, was the terrorists bombed the London Underground, that's the subway, the London Underground in 2005. And CNN was actually showing footage of people that had been shooting footage on their cell phones, albeit it was very grainy and, the resolution was terrible because this was the very beginning of cell phone shooting video. But they shared that stuff on the air. And of course, anytime we have fires or earthquakes or floods or maybe there's some police there's a battle between police and a suspect or whatever it might be, people start bust those cameras out, and then the next thing you know, they're putting them all over social media, and then you're seeing it on a number of different news sources. In fact, now that I think about it, preceding 2005, if you really want to talk about a citizen journalism, big case of citizen journalism would be the Rodney King beating, which was in 1993, where a guy had had just gotten a brand new videotape recorder, and across the street the LAPD had pulled over Rodney King and another person. Rodney King, of course, refused to get out of the car initially, and then the rest, as is history with the beating of Rodney King and the subsequent trial and all of that. That was literally, if you ever want to see an interesting or read about something interesting, read about how that tape that was shot was actually eventually given to KTLA, sold to KTLA, and then of course it then got aggregated to all sorts of major news outlets all over the world. So anyway, I guess that would be technically, the subway bombing in London. I've always said the subway bombings first, but now that I think about it, it's probably Rodney King. That would be more of an example of citizen journalism. The problem with citizen journalism, because there's always good things and bad things to everything I mentioned here. The problem with citizen journalism is that you don't have the people that are sharing this video aren't classically trained journalists. And honestly, whether they're doing it intentionally or just unintentionally, are a lot of times sharing images that are completely out of context, or if there's a confrontation going on, will get rolling after the initial confrontation started. So then all of a sudden you see someone retaliating, and that person then becomes the sort of the antagonist by default. And so, so that's another issue with citizen journalism. And, it's, like I said, it's a very powerful idea. It's not going anywhere. It's here to stay because of all the technology we have now, but that doesn't necessarily make it sometimes 100% great. We also have what's called hyperlocal, which is the idea, because of the web in particular, that you can, we do get news and information on stuff right here in our community. And there's often people that, will devote time to doing that. So, for example, here in Santa Clarita, you're not going to see a lot of stuff that happens here in Santa Clarita on like Channel 7 or Channel 4, because, LA is too big a market for a news station to focus on every single community in the greater Los Angeles area. So where do you see that? Well, KHTS, the radio station, has its own website where they do news. Obviously, Canyons News, which is our student publication, which I'll show you here in a second. We do local news. So does scbtv.com. The Signal has its own website, which is the newspaper in town. And I work with someone right here at COC. His name is Austin Dave. Maybe you know the name because, he's a freelance journalist who is, constantly putting, all sorts of breaking news on Instagram and Facebook and sharing it within the community. So that's what hyperlocal is. And then last but not least, you have backpack journalism, right? A backpack, and that is exactly what I actually teach here at COC, and that's how the industry is evolved. In other words, it's basically where you kind of do it all. So once upon a time, if you wanted to be a journalism person, you wanted to be an anchor, you were an anchor. If you wanted to be a photographer, you were a photographer. If you wanted to be an editor, you were an editor. If you wanted to be, a news writer, you were just a news writer, right? And I go through all of these like specific terms and what they do in my class. But now what the industry is demanding, whether you work for a newspaper that's now, basically on digital, you work for a station like ABC7, you work for a smaller station out there somewhere in the US, you work for a media, company, they want you to do it all, right? So, and so I want to show you something here. Let me get it queued up here on this side. This is actually a story about the Ukraine rally that one of my students did just recently. Here we go. So this is Canyons News. This is our student publication. It used to be just a newspaper, and of course now it's just entirely digital. But you can see this was written by a student by the name of Lauren Hanna. She went out to a local rally citizens were doing for Ukraine, for awareness for what was happening in Ukraine. And you can see she wrote an article, which we'll talk about article writing, or at least what newspapers are known for in part 2. But here's her video, which I'll play here in a second. She took photos and did descriptions, and it's a full-fledged backpack journalism type of experience where she not only did video, but she did the article. And so we'll play it for you so you can get a sense of what the video sounds like.
This video coming out of Ukraine shows a Russian missile striking a supermarket. It's images of this war that drew the people here at Bridgeport Park together.
You're here today. That tells you how important this event is for everybody.
Eddie Perez took it upon himself to bring about a sense of togetherness. He organized a charity rally to foster support for those in Ukraine.
This gave me a sense of hope. I can do something. Now, if I can just empower other people to do the same, then everybody will feel a sense of gratitude to serve others.
Serving others by selling shirts, bracelets, and flags to raise money for the Children's Medical Care Foundation in Ukraine.
The military war machine of Russia, of the Russian government, cruelly attacked peaceful Ukraine.
For Perez, it hits home. His family is still in Ukraine. That alone pushed him to take action.
When I heard from my niece, who said, "Uncle, are you coming to get me?" The impotence I felt of not being able to be there to grab her and bring her is beyond words.
The same uneasy feeling is shared by those still overseas in a country under attack.
Russia is trying to take from us our homes, our children, our parents, our spouses. Russia has come to destroy Ukraine. I hope all the world clearly sees that.
Seeing it is one thing, but doing something about it is another for Dr. Zoiana Ivanyuk. She is in Ukraine collecting funds to help sick children. She spoke from a bunker in Lviv.
I really truly believe that we will win and all the world will be a safe place for all the children.
A few attendees brought a piece of their home to Santa Clarita, many with songs special to Ukraine. The music carried a message. Though it may feel gloomy at times,
darkness will never prevail, never. And for those who have caused this harm, eventually they will go down. You will be victorious, I promise you that.
For Canyons News, I'm Lauren Hanna.
All right, so that's Lauren's story on Ukraine and the Ukrainian rally here in Santa Clarita, and very good story. I mean, I think from her standpoint, being that she's only been telling stories for just over like a year, I think she did a really good job with it, and that's kind of what my students do. Get my PowerPoint back up here for you guys. That's what my students do on a regular basis, in particular in MEA 225 and MEA 230. So in any event, that is what a backpacker. So she is very well trained. She knows how to write an article for a website. She knows how to produce a video for a website, and that is something that if you're going to get in the content creation business, in the journalism business, that's what the expectation is these days. So that is how it has really shifted. All right. Let us talk about differences between print, TV, and internet news, because we're going to get into, print, TV, and internet, right? We'll get obviously the newspapers in part 2 here, but broadcast news stories, for the most part, are driven by technology, not the story. I hate to say it that way, but in often cases it's true because, first of all, news stations and network news, cable news outlets, that do, video, really fall in love with all sorts of gimmicks. If you ever watch, for example, election coverage, watch any of the networks that when they do election night, of course, they're always doing the touch screens. They're like, oh, let me show you, let me move this stuff around, right? And that's very true. If you ever watch local weather, we always get very excited about the weather radar, right? And honestly, it's just kind of the nature of the beast, right? Because we can go live, it's instant. You can really, do something different than if you're just on you're reading an article. We also have to time stories to fit commercials. I spend a lot of time in both my MEA 125 and MEA 225 classes talking about producing, the fact that literally in traditional news coverage, if you're watching a show, and it can be also, by the way, sports broadcast too, so it's not just news, there is a finite amount of time that show is supposed to fit into. And because of that, you have to make the stories fit the show. So even if you have a story that is amazing and, you take 3 minutes to tell it, I always say the producer has to come along and deliver the bad news. That story has to be, cut in half to fit that slot, right? And that's something that happens every day. So we also, in broadcast news, I think there's an expectation, which, by the way, I think is getting a little bit shakier over time because, there's so many people, there's so many folks on social media that can then, sit there and cast doubt on it. But, news organizations, particularly broadcast organizations, are expected to be credible. In fact, when we see someone telling us the story on camera, we have a tendency to, believe them, right? And so my example of that is, think about, how for years, Chris Cuomo from CNN was supposedly a very trusted anchor on CNN. And then, of course, we later find out that, he was a shady character that no longer works for CNN. But there are also, think about it. Think about an anchor you like. There's certainly anchors out there that they're very good, that do a good job of delivering the news. We listen to them and they are credible. Walter Cronkite, I think, being the gold standard in the 1960s. Everyone talks about Walter Cronkite sort of being the guy, right? And it was because every time he spoke, there seemed to be a massive credibility to him. We also, what we see, we generally have a tendency to believe, right? I know it's a controversial statement, but that is how we kind of roll. Oh man, well, we saw it on screen, but there's definitely a counter argument to that, right? As for print reporters, they report on stories where they occur. In other words, what the difference between that and broadcast is, generally speaking, we have a tendency in the broadcast industry to sit on the anchor desk in Glendale at Channel 7 and tell you about things that happen all over Southern California or the world, and so we're in like Glendale, whereas in a lot of cases, the reporters that work for the LA Times or Washington Post or New York Times or whatever are often on the scene reporting on it. That's a huge difference, right? Here's a similarity, like we time stories to fit commercials, especially in the newspaper realm, like the actual physical paper, which no one reads anymore. There used to be a big move to cut stories to fit physical space, because depending on how much ad space you sold, that's how many pages you could put in the newspaper. That's why if you ever pick up a newspaper these days, it's super thin, because nobody's advertising in physical papers anymore because nobody's reading them. And so why spend money if you're a company on something that's not being read? But you do see more of that on the digital side, where you do see article writing on the digital side, and depending on how much an editor wants to include, they can do so on the digital side. We're expected, or I should say, print reporters are expected to be detached. I think there's a sort of, and it's been like this way in the industry, that I think sometimes when you're on television and people know you, whether you're someone at home watching it or it's someone you're covering, because they see you and they have a tendency to kind of treat you as a friend because you're coming into their living room every night. Well, print reporters don't have that luxury because no one sees them, right? They just see what they write. So, from personal experience, I covered a lot of different people when I was on the air in Cheyenne, my last job for 4 years, and I could walk into a store or a restaurant or into a game, and people would recognize me and immediately start, treating me like, I was one of the family, because I was in their living room all the time. So, whereas my roommate, who was a reporter for the local paper, would walk in there and no one would know him. So I get that, by the way, now, because because I produce at Channel 7, I'm behind the scenes. No one knows who I am. I will be out to dinner with Kurt Sandoval, our sports anchor, and we'll be sitting there eating, and people will come up, Kurt, oh, it's good to see you, love your work, blah blah blah, and no idea that I'm helping him produce the content, but no one knows who I am, and just fine with that. So just so you know. All right, another difference, right? And this is primarily some of the, I think, the reputation that particularly the visual side gets, the video side gets, right? The broadcast side, is that we're a pretty face, happy talk culture. In other words, the anchors have to look, perfectly coiffed hair, which I don't have, right? Good skin, handsome or very attractive, right? But kind of like the Anchorman, right, with Will Ferrell. There's that stereotype of the attractive but half-witted anchor, which in some cases is true and in some cases is not. There's some really talented people I work with who are also happen to be very blessed with good looks. But the fact is that that's the reputation, right? That happy talk refers to the ad-libbed or scripted news team banner, where you basically see the two anchors sitting side by side, commenting on whatever the story is. We saw that with Jonathan Gonzalez's Lost and Found story, right? We also are very, we're also known for sound bites, right? Which is basically short excerpts of sound that you see people say within news stories. And believe it or not, politicians and athletes and people that are used to being on camera will often, literally speak in what I call soundbite form, which is to say you could ask them whatever you want to ask them, and they could literally give you the theory of relativity in 15 seconds, right? That's what a soundbite is. But what's the equivalent of that in newsprint or an article, digital article? That's what's called a quote. And of course, sound bites have become the focus of intense criticism because sometimes we really don't learn anything. And politicians in particular, and prominent people really sort of will spew forth a 10 or 15-second soundbite or say something that, is very, very popular in a very short way, and and it's very misleading. So anyway, another thing I could talk about for a while. All right, the 24/7 news cycle has definitely changed the definition of news. So basically, like I said, once upon a time, there was just your network, ABC, CBS, NBC. You had your local stations. That was kind of what was sort of on the frontier. And then in the early 1980s, of course, CNN comes along. Ted Turner starts CNN, and then starts CNN Headline News. And then shortly thereafter, end of the 1980s, I want to say 89 maybe, Fox News is created, and then MSNBC. And of course, now cable news plays a huge role in not just news gathering and how we consume news, but literally has, I think, changed the landscape of how we view each other. And I mean, I'm not just going to throw it on cable news, but they, they get a lot of the credit for this, and it's not necessarily good credit. It can, but the fact is that it's created this idea of partisan programming. And by the way, something maybe you haven't thought about is that you have to understand when they're on the air for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, they have to just continually fill content. They have to continue to try to, keep an audience. And so they basically pander to whatever that audience is, right? So obviously Fox News is known as a conservative network, and conservatives watch it. Republicans watch Fox News. A lot of Republicans do. And so that audience very much is leans Republican, it leans conservative, it leans, right, if you say, or middle right. That's really kind of Fox News's bread and butter. So therefore, when presenting news stories and presenting ideas, in a lot of cases, it's presented in a way that's easily digestible by that political perspective. MSNBC, CNN, right? On the liberal side, to the left. NBC has really, I think, embraced the notion of sort of being the anti-Fox News, and so everything that Fox News is known for, from Republican to conservative to the right, liberal, MSNBC is known to liberal, Democrat, on the left. And CNN at one point was in the middle, and we're kind of caught in the middle. And then unfortunately, CNN made I think, just in my personal opinion, Jeff Zucker, who just recently got booted as the head of CNN, Jeff Zucker decided that he was kind of like all in, the network was all in on sort of being the anti-Trump Russian disinformation, pushing Russian disinformation narrative. And, I don't think anybody, I think you've got a lot of people that watch Fox News, you have a lot of people that watch MSNBC, and CNN is in a lot of trouble right now. And I think one of the things that I think CNN might be able to dig itself out of trouble is if it just embraced telling news neutrally, because I think people want that. I think people want to actually be able to listen to a story, read a story, and know that they're getting it told down the middle. And that's how news should be, period. And so it's been for someone like myself, who very much believes that journalism needs to be trusted, because there are a lot of things that are out there that need to be reported on. It's been very, very difficult for me to see that kind of come apart. And I'm about to show you an example here on the next slide. But bottom line is, audiences seem to prefer partisan talking heads. I'd like you to reflect on that. Do you? Do you like, because we're all in echo chambers right now, right? Philosophically, we've never been further apart. Because we just basically go to whatever social media reinforces whatever our opinions are. We go watch news stations and read news stories that basically, solidify that position that we have. And again, it can be, right, left, doesn't matter. The fact is, I think that we're in that frame of mind right now. And I think a lot of it has to do with my industry, and it's a very unfortunate thing. So let me talk about that a little bit. So reporters have traditionally align facts with an objective position. Well, at least that's that was kind of the long-term assumption that, reporters are supposed to be objective, right? Regardless of what they personally believed, that which was subjective feelings, that they would not let that bleed into their reporting or seep into their reporting. Unfortunately, I think over time, sparked by perhaps the addition of cable news, and I'm not pointing my fingers at Fox or MSNBC. I'm not saying, oh, it's all Fox News' problem or it's all MSNBC. It's all of them, right? Partisan cable channels have undermined reporters who try to report fairly. In fact, they lean into whatever their audience is. The reporters who report or the commentators that commentate lean into their audience and don't bother to even tell the other side or just completely ignore it. And it's really, I think, driven a wedge in the society to a dangerous point. And we need to push back, right? There are beliefs out there leading to suspicion of press bias, right? Reporters are out to get their subjects. There is no doubt that this is a fact. I would say if you followed CNN during the Trump era, Jim Acosta, their main White House, reporter, was constantly going after Trump much harder than any other, previous person that he was in contact with. It was unfortunate because I think he was asking some challenging questions and should have, but there seemed to be kind of a line that he crossed when he went from being challenging to just being gratuitous grandstander. So just my opinion, you're welcome to disagree with me. It's okay. Right. But the fact is that the reporters that are out there, at least there's this perception that they're out to get their subjects. Now, know the difference between a reporter and a commentator, by the way, or an anchor and a commentator. I think it's also important to understand. So, for example, at CNN, you would say Anderson Cooper is an anchor, right? Whereas Don Lemon is a commentator. At MSNBC or NBC, Lester Holt is a news anchor, whereas, give me someone I can think of at MSNBC off the top of my head. Well, there's a number of commentators at MSNBC. I'm brain farting on anyone at the moment. Andrea Mitchell used to be I think Andrea Mitchell used to be a what was considered a reporter, but she's more of a partisan person now. Mika Brzezinski and Joe Scarborough, right? For those of you that watch MSNBC, those are not news anchors. Those are commentators. On the Fox News side, just so you don't think I'm like leaving anybody out here, Fox News side, Brett Baer, news anchor, really good one, by the way. I really think he and Lester Holt are the two best. I really appreciate I think they're good, solid, like, journalists. But then you have, of course, Tucker Carlson, or you have Sean Hannity, Laura Ingraham, right? Those are the popular commentators on the Fox News side. And they come at their audience with a perspective. Anyway, the problem is that, in particular, the commentators and some of the actual journalists who should be neutral are leaving key facts out of reporting, ignoring or doxing stories. I want to highlight what I think is one of the most egregious examples of this in recent memory, and that is the Hunter Biden laptop story. Now, if you're not familiar with that, I have a link to an article from the New York Post, and basically, so in the fall of 2020, the New York Post got a hold of Hunter Biden's laptop and what was on it. And give you kind of a little bit of background. There were 3 laptops that were dropped off at a Delaware repair shop. One of them belonged to Hunter Biden, apparently. I don't know if all 3 did, but I definitely know one of them did. But in any event, the laptop itself, which was left there and never claimed, had all sorts of incriminating evidence on there of Hunter Biden's drug use. There were pictures of him with his, with him high. There were also emails and files concerning his financial relationship with China and the Ukraine. There were emails that connected him to then Vice President Joe Biden. This was a big story. It was dropped in October of 2020, and basically 90% of the journalism arena either did one of two things: either completely ignored it, or did a little bit of pushback. In fact, here is networks only covered Hunter Biden laptop story to dismiss it. And so instead of like actually investigating it, they were dismissive of it because, quite honestly, it would have been damaging to then candidate Joe Biden a month before an election in the Biden-Trump election cycle. But what made it even more, I think, disturbing, and then I'll give you the other side of it, is that the New York Post, which was reporting the story on its Twitter feed and a lot of other outlets, was actually deplatformed off of Twitter for over a month. And if you tried to share the story, the folks at Twitter actually started started kicking people off of Twitter, or at least suspending Twitter accounts for sharing the story. So the story at the time was said, well, that's not right. That was Russian disinformation, et cetera. Well, it turned out that was not true. In fact, in March of this year, in 2022, the New York Times, in a case that was made public and revealed on page 17, right, in like the 23rd paragraph, that indeed all of this material, this laptop, was actually legitimate, which was crazy, right? That the press wouldn't at least have investigated it back in October of 2020. Just ignored it and then tried to quietly say, well, actually, it is true in March of 22. And I just think that's, again, I know I'm a little political here at the moment, but the fact is that from a journalism standpoint, that was egregious, absolutely egregious. So please look at that article in the New York Post. I invite you to look at your own, do your own Google searches on the actual story. And draw your own conclusions. I'm not trying to tell you how to think, but I will say that I think that it was a tremendous disservice by the media at the time to bury that story, and then to actually have big tech go after news organizations to essentially 86 that story is, I think, very, very unsettling. So anyway. That's all I'm going to say about that, but feel free to click on that link and look at it. All right, last but not least of this part one, I want to talk about convergence, which is enhanced and changed journalism, okay? Obviously, with the internet, right, with phones, with phone apps, with the speed in which we can use digital, we can break stories. I mean, we have the ability to update breaking news instantly, and that's what we're used to. In fact, we're so used to relying, I think, on our phones and our web that, it's almost made the idea of waiting around until 5 o'clock at night to watch any kind of news broadcast obsolete. But again, it's basically, I just lost my train of thought, guys. Sorry, but basically, I think it's changed how we've done news gathering, and like I said, it's also been somewhat a little bit dysfunctional in the fact that because we can break news so quickly that sometimes we don't get the complete story right away, and we have a tendency to draw our conclusions about something, and then it turns out that there's more to it. All right, there's also problems with the online news. Email interviews give power to interview subjects. So once upon a time, before the internet, if you wanted to interview someone, you'd have to pick up the phone and have a physical phone interview with them. You'd have to interview them on camera, interview them in person. And now you have, lots of people to say, well, I don't have time for that. So why don't we just go ahead and, why don't you just send me some questions over email and I'll just answer whatever questions you have. Fine, but the problem is that it's not interpersonal, right? You can't tell if someone's, you can't tell if someone's being 100% truthful, especially if it's a tough story. You want to look in their eyes and see if you think they're bullshitting you, right? Wide-ranging resources have made it easy to intentionally or unwittingly copy others' work. One of the things, clearly that we struggle with here when we do storytelling at COC is that, students will oftentimes try to tackle more complicated stories like Ukraine, for example, or a political story, and they will grab stuff off of, other news sites, or grab pictures from Getty Images, for example, that, where that's a copyright issue. You see the same thing happen at news stations, so we're not exclusive to it. But certainly plagiarism is a big problem, right? Sometimes, and people don't realize it. And then, of course, I showed you backpack journalism, right? Reporters must meet the demands convergence is made on reporting. So you, as a reporter, have to know how to write an article. You know how to do a, interview. You have to go on camera. You have to know how to put stuff instantly up to social media. There's a lot that goes into it, and so that is something that when I was in the industry, getting into the industry, I didn't have the internet to worry about. I didn't have social media to worry about. I just had a couple. I had half of the issues that students I put out in the industry do now. So anyway, that is a look at the first part of the journalism lecture. We're going to focus more on chapter 8, which is newspapers, coming up in part 2. So make sure that you click on that. If there's anything that I have shared with you that you have more questions about in this, obviously part 1, by all means, feel free to shoot me a message or an email. And make sure you click on all the links that I did not click on that I wanted you to click on, so that you get a full encompassing view of what's going on. So that is all I've got for part 1. And when you see me again, I will likely see you for part 2. Take care.